Now, before you go flying, you'll pave your way to a safe flight. Now, this is a way to remember and examine the risk factors before you get into the air. The PAVE checklist puts the risk factors into 4 categories: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. You then examine the risks in each category and develop strategies to manage those risks. Now, this will take some practice. Did you ever notice how easy it is to pick out the risk factors in somebody else's flight and after the fact, but how hard it is to spot our own risk factors before and during the flight? Most of us just don't have the habit of identifying risk factors. Plus, we need to develop the skill of managing those risks. Now, when we've identified the risk factors for a particular flight, you need to make some decisions about how to control those risks. Now, one way to control risks is to set your own personal minimums for each category of risk factor when it's appropriate. Now, the FAA has already established some minimums for many of these categories, but you should give yourself permission to be more conservative. I call that conservatism without guilt. You know, some pilots feel that they are not fully qualified pilots unless they're willing to go right down to the FAA minimums in every situation. Well, that's not a good idea because of the philosophy behind the regulations. They're designed to be flexible and permissive. For instance, you can legally fly VFR at night, even in the mountains, with as little as 3 miles visibility and 500-foot clearance from the base of the clouds. But holy mackerel, would you really want to do that? Would you consider that fun? Or maybe you'd consider it stressful. Well, if you'd consider it stressful, it's probably not the right thing to do. The regulations allow night VFR flight in that kind of weather because in some circumstances it might be okay. And the philosophy is to allow pilots to exercise their own common sense. So set your own personal minimums for night VFR flight in the areas in which you fly. And even for flat country, you might want higher night VFR minimums than the FAA requires. Say 5 miles visibility at night might be much more comfortable. Now, notice we're stressing personal minimums. The reason the minimums must be personal is that you are a unique individual. Only you have your particular set of skills and abilities, and only you can make the right decisions for you. Now, let's talk about the risk factors and some strategies for managing each.
The P in PAVE stands for pilot. So let's talk about managing the risks associated with the pilot. Here you want to ask yourself if you, the pilot, are ready for this trip. You can start off with your physical condition by using the I'm Safe checklist. Let's take a look at it. The I stands for illness. Do you have a cold, the flu? Is there anything like that wrong with you? The M stands for medication. Are you taking any medicine that might affect your judgment or make you drowsy? The S stands for stress. There's no question that your concentration and your performance go downhill if you're under stress. The FAA lists medical conditions that require you to ground yourself, but stress is not one of them. But you need to consider the effects of stress on your performance. The A stands for alcohol. How recently have you had anything to drink? The F stands for fatigue and food and water. You might consider in this checklist item the inevitable result of food and water. In other words, remember to make some provision for the physiological needs of the pilot and passengers, especially for those of us with small bladders. A little portable potty can actually be a safety device if it allows you to be a little bit more judicious about where you land. The E stands for emotion. Think through your state of mind. If you're angry at the world, the way to work it out is not to go flying. You need to figure out a safer way to get over your anger. After you've thought about the items in the I'm Safe checklist, you'll want to think about your specific qualifications for this aircraft and this trip. Are you familiar with and current in this aircraft? You might need to think of such things as takeoffs and landings. How many have you done and how recently? Currency in type. How well do you know the systems on this aircraft? Do you know how to operate the audio panel and the avionics in this aircraft? With the popularity and variety of GPSs, that's a common problem. Are you IFR current? Are you night current? How about the terrain? For instance, are you familiar with flying in the mountains? And are you familiar enough with the airspace you'll be going through or near to keep yourself out of trouble? These are all things to think about when you ask yourself whether you as a pilot are prepared for this trip.
Now, the A in PAVE stands for the aircraft. So let's talk about the risks associated with the aircraft. Now, you want to ask yourself questions like, is this the right aircraft for my trip? What limitations of this aircraft will I have to deal with for this trip? And by the way, when you think about aircraft performance numbers, you need to remember that they were created with a brand new airplane and a professional test pilot who was willing to push the airplane to its limits to come up with good marketing numbers. Well, you won't have all of that, so you need to take the aircraft performance numbers with a grain of sense. And how about runways? Is the aircraft able to use the runways available for this trip with adequate margin? And can the airplane carry the load I need? Can it fly as high as I need for this trip? And is the aircraft equipped for this trip? You know, things like instruments, lights, and navigation and communications equipment. And is there enough fuel capacity with reserves for the trip legs I am planning? And finally, did I actually get the fuel I ordered?
The V, of course, stands for the environment. So let's talk about the risks associated with the environment. The first thing most of us think about when we think of the environment is the weather. As we said before, you especially will want to consider making your own minimums when it comes to the weather. You want to consider such things as what are the ceiling and the visibility, the possibility that the weather will be different than forecast, and have some alternative plans in that case. The winds at your airports, how strong a crosswind will you have? If you're flying in mountainous terrain, what will be the effect of the winds aloft? Are there any thunderstorms? If you'll be in the clouds, is there icing? The terrain you'll be flying over is also part of the environment. How high will you need to fly to clear that terrain? Will you be flying over remote areas? By the way, you might think of clothing and survival gear as part of the aircraft equipment for your flight. So are you carrying appropriate clothing and survival gear in case you have to spend some time on the ground after an emergency landing? Are you flying over water or unpopulated areas? If so, are you prepared for it? Could you have a loss of horizon at night, or even in the daytime over water? Is the trip at night? Except in special circumstances, it's a good idea to consider a night cross-country over all but the most populated areas as requiring an instrument rating and equipment. Have you pre-flighted all of the aircraft flights for a night flight? How about the airspace? What kind of airspace will you be flying in? Have you checked for any NOTAMs? Are there any runways or even complete airports closed due to construction or air shows? Are there any special use airspace or temporary flight restrictions you need to avoid?
Finally, the E in PAVE stands for external pressures. So let's talk about the external pressures on a pilot and the risks associated with them. Now, external pressures are those things that are actually not part of the flight, or they're external to the flight, that tend to put pressure on you throughout the flight. These are things like having someone waiting for you at the airport, or an important meeting or an event that you're supposed to attend, or it could be just a goal that you've set for yourself. These all put time pressure on you, and time pressure figures in the majority of accidents. Management of external pressures is the single most important key to risk management, because this is the one risk factor that can cause you to ignore all the other risk factors. So let's talk about ways to deal with external pressures. Now, this is one place where using standard operating procedures can be particularly helpful. Part of your personal SOP to cope with external pressures might be to always allow extra time on a trip so that you have time to make extra fuel stops or unexpected landings due to weather and still not be late. It might be to always have alternative plans for a late arrival. It could be to always have backup airline reservations or plan to leave early enough to still have time to drive on trips that are really important to you. So just like you always leave yourself an out for weather, your standard operating procedures should be to always leave yourself an out for the external pressures of a flight. Now, one way to do this is to always tell folks who are expecting you that you'll be conservative and you might not show up on time. You know, after all, people get delayed on the airlines or in automobiles too, so you shouldn't be so eager to prove your skill and the utility of a light plane that you're unwilling to allow yourself that same out at all times. And it isn't necessarily someone or something waiting for you at the destination that puts pressure on you to make a flight when you really shouldn't. Sometimes it's pure pressure from having a friend or family member traveling with you that you don't want to disappoint. Or it can be that you want to show how useful flying is after you spent all that time and money learning to fly. Now, I know in our case, our desire to prove to ourselves and to others the utility of general aviation airplanes occasionally had us flying when we really shouldn't have been. And because pilots are very goal-oriented people, it's often simply the pressure you put on yourself to complete a particular task, in this case, the flight that you have planned. The external pressures on a pilot tend to lurk in the background, but they underlie everything he or she does. A quick review of the external pressures on your flight makes sure that you think about these issues and actually make a decision about them, and don't accidentally put yourself in a dangerous or a stressful situation. So let's talk about some of the ways that you can deal with external pressures. First of all, you need to know how to reach and notify the people you will be meeting. Plus, and I don't mean to shock you here, I normally actually lie to the people who will be meeting me at the airport, because I tell them that we'll be there 30 to 60 minutes later than I'm really planning on arriving. This gives me a chance to leave late, divert around weather, and still make it on time as far as they're concerned. And if you do get there on time as far as you're concerned, it gives you the time to unload and clean up the airplane and refuel it for the next trip. I also tell passengers that we may not get there on a firm schedule. I tell them that if they really have to be there at a certain time, they should go on the airlines. And I've had people actually go from the FBO over to the airline terminal to take the airlines instead. And it doesn't hurt my feelings a bit. And it takes the pressure off and makes it a lot safer for me and my other passengers. Another trick is to remove your own pressure to get there on time. I take credit cards and check out alternative transportation and alternative hotel plans ahead of time just in case. So I'm not trying to formulate alternative plans for my arrival at the same time I'm coping with unexpected weather or other problems. It's also important to make sure that you don't feel pressured to get back home even on a casual day flight. Even on these casual flights, I always take a small overnight kit with prescriptions, contact solutions, and toiletries. And I remember my own goal-oriented behavior. We all need to take steps to make sure that we don't trap ourselves.
One other thing. Pilots often say that usually no one thing causes an accident. It takes several things that finally add up to an accident. And if you can break that building chain, you can prevent the accident. Well, that's true. So here's what you should watch for. If you have an item that's marginal in a single risk factor category, that might not be so bad. But if you have items in more than one category, you could be headed for trouble and not even know it. We call the compounding effect from multiple categories of risk factors the cumulative effect. The cumulative effect is the insidious cause of most accidents. So here's a rule you should make. If you have marginal items in 2 or more risk factor categories, don't go. If you're marginally tired and everything else is okay, you might be able to safely make the decision to go. But if you're marginally tired and the weather is marginal, then that's a no-go.